A black officer, known for his dedication and fairness, was humiliated and arrested in front of a shocked crowd, without any explanation or evidence. What led to this unjust arrest? Where are you watching this? Write in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the denouement of this story. The city streets were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of street lights, while the distant hum of traffic provided a sense of calm. To the casual observer, everything appeared normal, serene even. But beneath this surface of peace and order, the deeper tensions of racial injustice simmered like a dormant volcano. For many, especially those who bore the weight of being black in a society still riddled with prejudice, this tranquility was a fragile facade, ready to crack at any moment. Daniel Harris knew this all too well. As a black police officer, Daniel had dedicated his life to upholding the law, to serving and protecting the very city he had grown up in. For most of his career, he had fought to prove that he was more than the color of his skin, that he was an officer first, a protector of justice, an equal among his peers. But every day, he was reminded that no matter how well he wore his badge, no matter how bravely he stood in the line of duty, to some people, he was still just another black man. The night was still young when Daniel climbed into his old car and headed home after a long shift. The quiet hum of the engine and the soft vibration of the car were comforting after hours of patrolling the city's streets. His mind drifted, thinking of home, of his sister Monica, a brilliant civil rights attorney who had been his rock through thick and thin. Despite her success, Monica had never forgotten where they came from or the struggles they faced as a black family in America. The thought of her always brought a sense of pride and peace to Daniel. She was a fighter, like him, but in a different way. While he fought for justice on the streets, she fought for it in the courts. They were a team, two sides of the same coin, both dedicated to the same cause, equality and justice for all. And yet, no matter how much progress they made, the world constantly reminded them that they had to fight harder than most. As he drove through the quiet streets of the city, Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a news broadcast on the radio. A recent murder had taken place earlier that evening in one of the more affluent parts of town. A high-profile case, it seemed. The details were sparse, but the suspect was described as a black male, mid-30s, wearing dark clothing. Daniel frowned slightly, but I paid it little attention. It was a vague description, too vague to concern him personally. He had seen this kind of situation play out too many times before. The description would fuel stereotypes, and the manhunt would begin, targeting anyone who fit the superficial profile. He sighed, turning off the radio. It was frustrating, but he had become accustomed to this kind of news. Black men were too often reduced to faceless threats, nameless figures who could be targeted simply because they fit the description. Despite his years on the force, Daniel knew he was not immune to such profiling. He had witnessed it time and time again, both as an officer and as a black man. As he approached a familiar intersection, the red light glowing ahead, his thoughts shifted back to his sister. He had promised to visit her soon, to catch up over dinner. They had both been so busy with their respective careers that moments like that were becoming rarer. Monica had been handling a particularly tough case recently, fighting against systemic housing discrimination that had disproportionately affected black families in their city. It was a hard fight, and Daniel admired her resilience. The light turned green, and Daniel eased the car forward, turning onto the quieter residential street that led to his home. The houses here were modest, well-kept, with neatly trimmed lawns, and the occasional porch light flickering in the distance. It was a peaceful neighborhood, the kind that made you feel safe, like you could relax and forget the stresses of the day. But for Daniel, safety was always relative. He had grown up here, seen the gradual gentrification of the area, the changing faces of his neighbors. It wasn't a bad thing, necessarily, but he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. There were more suspicious glances now, more whispers behind closed doors, more patrol cars cruising through in search of something or someone out of place. A soft sigh escaped his lips as he pulled into his driveway, cutting the engine and sitting back in his seat for a moment. The night was quiet, peaceful even. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. It was subtle, the kind of thing you learn to live with when you're black in America, always feeling like you're being watched, judged, like you're one misstep away from becoming a headline. He knew all too well that no matter how many years he had spent serving his community, there were people, sometimes even his fellow officers, who would never see him as anything more than his skin color. As he sat there, his phone buzzed softly in his pocket. Daniel fished it out and saw a message from Monica. "Monica, hey, just checking in. Make sure you get some rest tonight. We'll catch up soon, okay? Love you." A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. She always knew when to reach out. Typing a quick reply, he reassured her that he was fine and that they'd make time for that dinner soon. He pocketed the phone and glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror for a moment. His face, tired but calm, stared back at him. The years of service, the late nights, the weight of responsibility. It was all there. But so was the determination. Daniel was proud of what he'd accomplished, proud of the work he did, even if the world wasn't always kind in acknowledging it. As he stepped out of the car, locking it behind him, the cool night air brushed against his skin. He took a deep breath, savoring the brief moment of calm. Tomorrow would be another long day, filled with the usual challenges of his job. But tonight, for now, he was home. He glanced up at the sky, the stars twinkling faintly above the city's glow. It was a simple, quiet night. And in moments like this, he allowed himself to feel hopeful. Hopeful that maybe things were slowly changing. Maybe one day, people would see beyond the color of his skin. Maybe one day, the fight wouldn't feel so endless. But that day was not today. Daniel walked up the short path to his front door, fishing out his keys, when something in the air changed. A low hum of tension, almost imperceptible, but familiar. He paused, hand hovering over the doorknob, as the distant sound of sirens caught his attention. Sirens were nothing new to him. He heard them every day on the job, but tonight, they felt different, closer. And for a brief moment, he wondered who they were chasing. Which part of the city was in turmoil this time? Little did he know, the turmoil was heading straight for him. In the distance, the sound of screeching tires and flashing red and blue lights cut through the peaceful night. The sharp, piercing wail of police sirens grew louder, echoing off the quiet suburban houses. Daniel's hand froze on the doorknob as the tension in the air thickened. His instincts, honed by years of service, told him something was wrong. He turned slowly, peering down the street as the flashing lights illuminated the trees and houses, casting distorted shadows across the peaceful neighborhood. A police cruiser careened around the corner, its tires screeching as it skidded to a halt in front of his driveway. Two white officers jumped out, their expressions hard and focused like hunters who had just cornered their prey. Daniel's heart quickened. Something about the intensity of their movements sent a chill down his spine. He had seen this scene play out before, too many times, but never like this. Never with him as the target. One of the officers, tall and broad-shouldered, barked an order. "Hey, stop right there." Daniel's hands instinctively rose in front of him, palms open in a non-threatening gesture. Confusion clouded his mind, but his voice remained calm, though laced with the beginnings of disbelief. "What's going on?" Officers. The taller officer, whose nameplate read Carter, narrowed his eyes, his hand already hovering over his gun. "You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for. Black male, mid-30s, wearing dark clothes." Daniel blinked, trying to process what was happening. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening to him. "I'm an officer," he said, his voice steady, but edged with rising anxiety. "I'm Daniel Harris. I work with the department." The second officer, shorter but just as menacing, sneered. "Yeah? Well, tonight, you're a suspect." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He had heard stories of this kind of encounter, even from fellow black officers, but he had always believed that his badge offered some level of protection, that his years of service, his dedication to the law, would somehow shield him from the brutality he had sworn to fight. But now, standing in the glow of flashing red and blue lights, he realized that none of that mattered. To these men, he was nothing more than his skin color. Carter's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Get down on the ground. Hands where I can see them." Daniel's body tensed. His mind raced, searching for a way to defuse the situation. "Listen, this is a mistake. I just got off my shift. I can show you my badge, my ID." I said, "Get down." Carter's hand tightened on the grip of his gun, the threat clear in his eyes. Daniel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, a sinking realization that there was no reasoning with these men. They weren't interested in explanations. They weren't interested in justice. They were interested in power. And in that moment, they had all the power. Slowly, deliberately, Daniel began to lower himself to the ground. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear of what he might have done, but from fear of what they might do. He knew that one wrong move, one perceived slight, could escalate the situation beyond control. The world had seen it happen before. He had seen it happen before. As his knees touched the cold pavement, Carter moved in quickly, shoving him face first into the ground. The rough asphalt scraped against Daniel's skin, and the weight of Carter's knee pressed into his back, crushing the air from his lungs. "Stay still," Carter growled as he yanked Daniel's arms behind his back and slapped the cold metal handcuffs onto his wrists. The cuffs bit into his skin, too tight, cutting off circulation. Daniel winced, but stayed silent, knowing any protest would only make things worse. Around them, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the sirens and the commotion. People pulled out their phones, recording the scene, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Daniel could hear them murmuring, some voices rising in anger. "He didn't do anything. Let him go. This is wrong." But Carter and his partner didn't seem to care. They were locked in, focused on their task. Daniel's pleas fell on deaf ears as Carter roughly hauled him to his feet. "You have the right to remain silent," Carter said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." Daniel's breath came in short gasps as he struggled to maintain his composure. "I'm not resisting. Just let me explain." "Shut up," Carter snapped, giving Daniel a hard shove toward the waiting police car. The force of the shove nearly sent him stumbling, but Daniel caught himself, gritting his teeth against the humiliation washing over him. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had spent years building a reputation as a fair and just officer, dedicated to protecting his community. And now, in front of the very people he had sworn to serve, he was being treated like a common criminal. Worse, he was being treated like a threat, an enemy, simply because he fit the description. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the cell phones continued to record, capturing every moment of the injustice unfolding before them. Daniel's mind raced, a torrent of emotions swirling within him. Fear, anger, humiliation. But above all, a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal. The very system he had devoted his life to was now turning on him, showing its true colors. "Put him in the car," the second officer said, motioning to the cruiser. Daniel was roughly shoved into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind him. The cold leather of the seat pressed against his skin as he leaned back, trying to steady his breath. Through the tinted windows, he could see the crowd growing, their faces lit by the flashing lights. He could see their shock, their outrage. But what could they do? What could anyone do? Inside the car, the silence was deafening. Daniel's thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He had done nothing wrong. He knew that. But in this moment, the truth didn't matter. All that mattered was that he fit the description. And for too many people, that was enough. His hands, still cuffed behind his back, began to go numb. The cold metal dug into his wrists, a constant reminder of the power these officers held over him. Power that they wielded with impunity, knowing that their word would be taken over his, knowing that, in the eyes of many, he was guilty until proven innocent. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Daniel's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories, fears. He thought of Monica, of how she had always warned him that the system was rigged against people like them. He had believed her, of course, but he had also believed in the power of change. He had believed that by working within the system, he could help make things better. But now, sitting in the back of a police car, handcuffed and humiliated, he realized just how fragile that belief had been. The door opened suddenly, and Officer Carter appeared, his face set in a hard line. He reached in, grabbing Daniel by the arm and yanking him out of the car. "Let's go. You're going downtown." Daniel staggered as he was pulled from the car, his legs stiff from the awkward position he had been forced into. Carter and his partner flanked him on either side as they led him toward the police station, their grip tight and unyielding. The station was a blur of harsh fluorescent lights and cold, sterile walls. Daniel barely registered the buzz of activity around him, the ringing phones, the hurried footsteps of officers moving about. His focus was on the weight of the cuffs around his wrists, the way his arms ached from being twisted behind his back. He had never felt more vulnerable, more powerless. Carter marched him through the booking area, his voice loud and authoritative, as he processed Daniel into the system. The other officers glanced over, some with curiosity, others with a flicker of recognition. But none of them intervened. None of them questioned what was happening. To them, it was just another suspect being brought in. Just another arrest. As Carter completed the booking process, Daniel's thoughts drifted to Monica. She would find out about this soon. He was sure of it. And when she did, she would move heaven and earth to get him out. But the damage had already been done. Even if he was released, even if this was all sorted out, his reputation would never be the same. His dignity had already been shattered. Carter finally removed the cuffs, though the relief was brief. Daniel's wrists throbbed, the skin raw where the metal had dug in. Without a word, Carter motioned for him to follow. They walked down a long, dimly lit hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. At the end of the hallway, a holding cell awaited. Carter unlocked the door, opening it with a cold, mechanical efficiency. "Get in." Daniel stepped inside, the door clanging shut behind him. The cell was small, cramped, with a cold metal bench and a single flickering light overhead. It smelled of sweat and stale air, a reminder of the countless others who had passed through these walls. He sat down on the bench, his head in his hands, trying to steady his breath. But the reality of his situation was suffocating. He had become the very thing he had spent his life fighting against, a victim of a system that saw him as nothing more than a threat because of the color of his skin. Hours passed in a haze of frustration and disbelief. His mind raced with questions, but no answers came. His whole life had been devoted to upholding the law, to protecting people, to believing in the system. Now, that same system had betrayed him. Back at the police station desk, Carter filled out the final paperwork, his expression one of satisfaction. He had done his job. And for him, Daniel Harris was just another black man who had stepped out of line. Nothing more, nothing less. Daniel's night was far from over, and as he sat in that cold, dark cell, he realized something. He was no longer just an officer. He was no longer just a man of the law. He was now a target. And the fight for his freedom, his dignity, and his very identity was just beginning. The young man raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a wry smile. "Let me guess, black man in the wrong neighborhood?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. There was no point in denying it. This stranger knew the score just as well as he did. They both did. "Yeah," Daniel muttered, his voice low. "Something like that." The young man chuckled softly, but there was no humor in the sound. It was the bitter laugh of someone who had seen too much, someone who had been beaten down by the system so many times that he no longer expected anything different. "Welcome to the club, brother," the man said, leaning back against the wall. "They love to put us in here, don't they? Doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. All it takes is being black." Daniel clenched his fists, the anger bubbling up inside him. He wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't supposed to be like this, that the system was supposed to protect people, not destroy them. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, he knew the truth. He had known it for years, but he had refused to admit it to himself. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it had been designed to. And he, like so many others, had been naive enough to believe that he could somehow change it from the inside. The young man shook his head, his eyes dark with cynicism. "You think they're gonna let you out? You think you're different because you wear a badge?" Daniel's throat tightened. The badge. He had always believed it would protect him, that it would make him an equal among his fellow officers. But tonight, it had meant nothing. The moment those officers saw him, they didn't see a fellow cop. They didn't see a man who had dedicated his life to justice. They saw a threat, a black man. And that was all they needed to see. "They don't care about that," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not when you look like me." The young man nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Yeah, they don't care about any of us. We're all guilty in their eyes, just for being born with the wrong skin." The silence settled between them again, heavy and oppressive. Daniel leaned back against the cold wall of the cell, his thoughts racing. He had been through so much in his career, seen so many injustices, but he had always believed he was making a difference. He had believed in the system, believed that if he worked hard enough, if he proved himself, he could change things. But now, sitting in this cell, stripped of his dignity and his freedom, he felt the weight of that belief crumbling. His mind drifted to Monica, his sister. She had always been more skeptical of the system than he was, always more willing to fight against it than to work within it. He had admired her for that, but he had also thought she was too cynical, too jaded. Now, he realized she had been right all along. Monica had fought tirelessly for the rights of people like him, for those who had been wronged by a system that never saw them as fully human. And now he needed her more than ever. But would she be able to help him, or was he too far gone already? A knot formed in his stomach at the thought. He knew Monica would do everything in her power to get him out of here, to clear his name. But even if she succeeded, the damage was already done. His reputation, his career, his very sense of self had been shattered. He would never be the same again. The door to the cell block creaked open, and Daniel's heart leapt in his chest. A guard appeared, his keys jingling as he approached. "Harris," the guard called, his voice flat and emotionless. "You've got a visitor." Daniel's mind raced. It had to be Monica. She had found out what had happened, and she was here to help. Relief surged through him as he stood, the weight of the night beginning to lift, if only slightly. The guard unlocked the cell door, and motioned for Daniel to follow. As they walked down the narrow hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls, Daniel's thoughts returned to his sister. She would know what to do. She would have a plan. But as they neared the visitation room, his relief was tempered by the harsh reality of the situation. No matter what Monica could do, no matter how strong her case, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long, painful fight. The system wasn't designed to admit its mistakes, especially when it came to people like him. The guard opened the door to the small, sterile room where visitors met with detainees. Daniel stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest, and there, sitting at the table, was Monica. Her face was a mask of controlled fury, her eyes blazing with a determination that only years of fighting injustice could forge. She stood as soon as she saw him, crossing the room in a few quick strides. "Daniel," she said, her voice low but filled with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I can't believe this is happening." Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of the night pressing down on him once more. "Monica, I didn't do anything. I swear I know," she interrupted, her hand gripping his tightly. "I know you didn't, but this isn't just about what you did or didn't do. This is about the system. They saw you as a black man, and that was all they needed." Her words cut through him, sharp and undeniable. She was right, of course. She always had been. "I'm going to get you out of here," Monica continued, her voice steady and resolute. "I've already started working on it, but it's not going to be easy. They're going to fight us every step of the way." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. He had expected as much. The system wasn't just going to let him walk away. It never did. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know if I can ever go back to being who I was." Monica's expression softened, and she squeezed his hand gently. "You don't have to. This has changed everything. But we'll get through it, together." For the first time that night, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint, but it was there, and it was enough to keep him going. As they sat down at the table, Monica pulled out a notebook filled with legal notes and strategies. "We're going to fight this, Daniel. We're going to expose them for what they are, and we're going to make sure they pay for what they've done to you." Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just a victim. He wasn't just another black man wrongfully accused. He was Daniel Harris, and with his sister by his side, he would fight for his name, his dignity, and his freedom. The battle ahead would be long, and the odds were stacked against them. But for the first time that night, Daniel allowed himself to believe that they might just have a chance. As the guard signaled that their time was up, Daniel rose from the table, his eyes locking with Monica's. "We're in this together," she said softly, her voice filled with determination. "Always," Daniel replied. He was led back to his cell. But this time, the despair wasn't as overwhelming. The walls didn't feel as suffocating, because now he knew he wasn't alone. He had Monica, and together they would take on the system that had wronged them both. The fight had only just begun. Monica sat in her office, the heavy hum of the city streets below filtering through the cracked window. The soft glow of her desk lamp cast a faint light on the countless legal documents scattered before her. Her mind raced as she sifted through case files, scribbling notes and highlighting key points in preparation for the fight of her life. She had faced uphill battles before, cases where the deck was stacked against her, where systemic racism reared its ugly head at every turn. But this one was different. This wasn't just about another client. This was personal. It was her brother, Daniel, wrongfully arrested, humiliated, and betrayed by the very system they had both spent their lives trying to fix. Her phone buzzed on the desk, dragging her attention from the pages of notes. It was a text from one of her contacts at the police department. Someone who had been quietly feeding her information. Contact. Monica, I just checked the system. There's no official reason for Daniel's arrest. Looks like they're stalling. Be careful. Monica's lips pressed into a thin line. She had expected this. Daniel's arrest hadn't followed protocol. There were no legitimate charges. No real investigation. It had been a rush to judgment. A rush to assert control over a black man who fit the description. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. What had they hoped to achieve by arresting Daniel so publicly? Was it just another example of racial profiling, or was there something more? Something darker? Her instincts, sharpened by years of legal battles, told her this wasn't just a random mistake. Daniel's arrest felt deliberate, almost calculated. And the more she dug, the more she realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. The corruption within the police force ran deep, and Daniel had likely become a target, not just because of his race, but because of the work he had done to expose it. She glanced at the clock. It was late, but she couldn't rest. Not yet. She needed to gather more evidence, more witnesses, more leverage to tear apart the flimsy case against her brother. Grabbing her phone, she dialed a number. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Monica," the voice said, a note of surprise in his tone. "It's late. What's going on?" "I need to meet with you, Ace," Monica replied, keeping her voice steady but firm. Ace Robinson had been one of her most trusted investigators for years. He had a reputation for getting his hands dirty when it came to uncovering the truth. And right now, she needed someone like him on her side. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Ace spoke again. "All right. Where?" "My office. Now." An hour later, Ace strolled into her office, his tattooed arms folded across his chest, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He was a tall, intimidating man, the kind who could walk into any situation and command attention. But beneath the tough exterior, Monica knew he had a sharp mind for strategy and an unwavering commitment to justice. "You look worse than usual," Ace said, offering a half-smirk as he sat down across from her desk. "What's going on with Daniel?" Monica exhaled slowly, trying to collect her thoughts. "It's a setup, Ace. I don't have all the details yet, but I know it. They're framing him for a robbery he didn't commit, and it's all tied to something much bigger." Ace raised an eyebrow. "You think this is about the corruption in the force?" "I do," Monica replied, her voice cold with determination. "Daniel's been investigating dirty cops for years. I think they finally decided to take him out of the equation." Ace nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious. "All right. Where do we start?" Monica handed him a stack of documents. "These are the preliminary files I've gathered. There's no legitimate reason for Daniel's arrest, and the details of the robbery are vague at best. I need you to dig deeper, find out who's behind this, find the connections between the officers who arrested him and the people Daniel was investigating." Ace took the files, flipping through them with practiced ease. "I'll start digging tonight. But you should know, Monica, if this goes as deep as we think it does, there will be pushback, and it won't be subtle." Monica's eyes darkened, but her resolve didn't waver. "I don't care. I'll do whatever it takes to clear Daniel's name." Ace gave her a long look before standing up, tucking the files under his arm. "You've got guts, Monica. That's why I like working with you. Just be careful. These people don't play fair." She nodded, watching as he left her office. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, but she pushed it aside. There was no time for fear, not when her brother's life and career were hanging in the balance. As the door clicked shut behind Ace, Monica's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from an unknown number. "Unknown. Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Her heart skipped a beat, and a chill ran down her spine. She stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. It wasn't the first time she had been threatened during a case, but this felt different. It felt personal. Monica's hands tightened around the phone as she considered her options. Whoever had sent the message wanted her to back off, to stop pushing for the truth. But that wasn't going to happen. She wouldn't be intimidated, not by corrupt cops, not by criminals, and certainly not by cowards hiding behind anonymous messages. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. If they were threatening her, that meant she was getting closer to the truth. And if they thought they could scare her into submission, they didn't know her very well. With a defiant swipe, she deleted the message and stood up, pacing the room. The pressure was mounting, but so was her determination. She wouldn't let them win. She wouldn't let them destroy Daniel's life. As she paced, her thoughts drifted back to her brother, sitting in that cold, dark cell. She knew what this was doing to him. She could imagine the humiliation, the anger, the betrayal he must be feeling. He had given everything to the police force, had believed in the power of justice, only to be treated like a common criminal because of the color of his skin. But Monica wasn't just fighting for Daniel. She was fighting for every black man who had been wrongfully accused, every person who had been caught in the crosshairs of a system that saw them as expendable. This was about more than just one case. It was about exposing the rot at the core of the very institution that claimed to serve and protect. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, late nights, and endless research. Ace worked tirelessly, uncovering new leads and connecting the dots between the officers who had arrested Daniel and a network of corruption that ran deeper than either of them had anticipated. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. Monica started receiving more threatening messages, some more explicit than others. She wasn't the only one in danger. Ace had been followed twice, and his office had been broken into. But they pressed on, knowing that the truth was within their reach. One night, as Monica sat in her office reviewing Ace's latest findings, she heard a noise from the hallway outside. Her heart skipped a beat, her body tensing as she listened. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was there, just outside her door. Her pulse quickened as she reached for her phone, her mind racing. She had been careful, had taken every precaution to protect herself, but she knew that if someone really wanted to get to her, they would find a way. The door creaked open, and Monica's breath caught in her throat. But instead of an intruder, Ace stepped into the room, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. Monica exhaled in relief, but her tension quickly returned. "What is it?" Ace dropped a thick folder on her desk, his eyes hard. "I found the connection." Monica opened the folder, her heart pounding as she scanned the documents. What she saw made her blood run cold. The officers who had arrested Daniel were directly tied to a group of corrupt cops that had been operating under the radar for years. But that wasn't all. The network extended beyond the police department, into the city's political structure, and even the district attorney's office. They had been protecting their own, covering up crimes and framing innocent people for years. And Daniel was their latest target. "This goes deep," Ace said, his voice low. "Deeper than we thought. They're not just trying to protect themselves. They're trying to silence anyone who gets in their way." Monica's hands shook as she closed the folder. She had known this case was big, but she hadn't realized just how far the corruption reached. The threats she had received were more than just intimidation tactics. They were warnings that she was treading on dangerous ground. But instead of fear, Monica felt a surge of resolve. If they thought they could scare her off, they were wrong. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. This was about taking down a system that had thrived on oppression and injustice for far too long. "They won't get away with this," she said, her voice hard as steel. "We're going to bring them down." Ace nodded, his expression mirroring her determination. "Damn right we are, but we have to be careful. They're already onto us. One wrong move, and this could blow up in our faces." Monica knew he was right. The fight ahead would be dangerous, and they were up against powerful enemies. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Monica stood in front of the courthouse, her briefcase in hand and her head held high. The fight for Daniel's freedom had only just begun, but she was ready. The pressure was mounting and the threats were real. But the truth was stronger than any of it, and with Ace by her side and the evidence they had uncovered, Monica knew that they were closer than ever to exposing the corruption that had ensnared her brother. She wasn't just fighting for Daniel, she was fighting for justice, and she wouldn't stop until it was won. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Monica stood with her back straight, staring at the imposing structure ahead of her. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she couldn't afford to waver. Not now. She adjusted her jacket, her mind focused, though her thoughts raced with the intensity of the investigation and the danger that now surrounded her and Daniel. In the days following Ace's discovery, the conspiracy had unfolded like a grotesque nightmare. The more they uncovered, the more tangled the web of corruption appeared. What had begun as an investigation into her brother's wrongful arrest had spiraled into something much larger, exposing the rot that infested not only the police department, but the very political and judicial systems that governed the city. Ace had connected the dots between Daniel's arresting officers and a network of dirty cops who had operated with impunity for years. These officers were part of a larger syndicate that had been covering up their own crimes, framing innocent people and suppressing any whistleblowers who dared to challenge them. And now, Monica and Daniel were squarely in their crosshairs. The case was no longer just about freeing her brother. It was about dismantling a system that had operated in the shadows for far too long. Monica's footsteps echoed through the halls as she entered the courthouse. Ace had already started gathering witnesses, digging through old case files, and pulling every favor he had ever earned in the city to get them closer to the truth. But with each passing day, the threats became more tangible. Monica had been followed twice on her way home from the office, and her apartment had been broken into. Whoever was behind the conspiracy wasn't just trying to intimidate her. They were trying to stop her at any cost. Inside the courthouse, she made her way to one of the private meeting rooms. Ace was already waiting for her, leaning against the wall, his face set in a grim expression. He looked more tired than usual, the weight of the case clearly taking its toll. Despite his tough exterior, Monica knew that even he was feeling the pressure. This was unlike anything they had faced before. Morning, Monica greeted him, her voice low. "How are we looking?" Ace handed her a thick file, his eyes scanning the room, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "Not great. I've been talking to some of the officers who left the force a few years ago. They're scared, Monica, real scared. These guys we're up against, they've got connections everywhere. I'm talking judges, politicians, the works." Monica flipped through the file, her stomach knotting as she saw the names and affiliations Ace had uncovered. Corruption ran deep, threading through every level of the city's leadership. It was no wonder Daniel had been caught in their snare. He had been investigating the wrong people, asking the wrong questions, and now they wanted to make an example of him. "They think they're untouchable," Monica muttered, her jaw tight. "But they're wrong." Ace shook his head, his expression grim. "These guys don't just play dirty. They eliminate threats. The deeper we dig, the more dangerous this becomes. We're not just taking on the police department anymore. We're taking on the entire city's power structure." Monica met his gaze, her eyes burning with determination. "I don't care how deep it goes." "We're not stopping," Ace nodded, though his usual bravado was tempered by a clear understanding of the risks. He knew what they were up against. They both did. "We've got a couple of key witnesses lined up for tomorrow," he said, shifting the conversation back to business. "Former officers, a few community members who saw things they shouldn't have. But getting them to testify won't be easy. They're terrified of retaliation," Monica sighed. "They have every reason to be, but we need them. We need their testimonies if we're going to blow this case open." She sat down at the table, spreading the documents out in front of her, her mind racing through the details. They were close, so close to exposing the truth. But with every step forward, the danger escalated. If they were going to take down this network of corruption, they had to be smart. They had to be strategic. One wrong move, and everything they had worked for could come crashing down. "We can't afford any more delays," Monica said, her voice firm. "We need to get in front of a judge and start laying out the evidence. If we wait too long, they'll find a way to bury it." Ace crossed his arms, frowning. "That's the other thing. I've been hearing rumors that they've got people inside the courthouse, judges who are on their payroll. If we're going to take this to trial, we need to make sure we're in front of someone who isn't compromised." Monica's stomach twisted at the thought. Corruption was one thing, but if the judiciary was compromised, they had little hope of getting a fair trial. The entire system was stacked against them. "Any idea which judges we can trust?" she asked, already fearing the answer. Ace shook his head. "It's hard to say, but I've got a couple of people on the inside who might be able to help us figure that out." Monica leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The enormity of what they were up against was staggering, but she couldn't afford to falter now. Daniel's life was at stake, and so was the integrity of everything she had spent her career fighting for. "They won't get away with this," she said quietly, more to herself than to Ace. "We're going to expose them. All of them." Ace nodded, but there was a caution in his eyes. "We need to be careful, Monica. They've already tried to shut you down. If they think we're getting too close—" Monica cut him off, her voice cold and sharp. "Let them try." Ace studied her for a moment before nodding again, his expression unreadable. "All right, let's get to work." The next few days were a blur of meetings, interviews, and late-night strategy sessions. Monica and Ace worked tirelessly, chasing down leads and gathering evidence. Witnesses were hesitant, afraid of the repercussions, but slowly they began to open up. Piece by piece, the full scope of the conspiracy came into focus. The officers who had arrested Daniel were part of a larger operation, one that had been orchestrating robberies, drug trafficking, and other criminal activities for years, all while hiding behind their badges. And they weren't acting alone. Several high-ranking officials in the police department had been complicit, covering up their crimes and ensuring that anyone who tried to expose them was either silenced or discredited. Daniel's arrest had been a warning, a message to anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. But Monica wasn't backing down. She was determined to bring the whole operation crashing down, no matter the cost. Late one evening, as Monica and Ace sat in her office, going over the final preparations for the trial, the phone rang. Monica answered it, her heart racing. "This is Monica Lawson," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "Miss Lawson, this is Eleanor Harrington." Monica's blood ran cold. She knew that name all too well. Eleanor Harrington was one of the city's most powerful real estate moguls, with deep ties to the political elite. Her name had come up in Ace's investigation as someone who might be connected to the network of corrupt cops. But they hadn't found concrete evidence yet. "What do you want?" Monica asked, her voice sharp. There was a brief pause before Eleanor spoke again, her tone measured and controlled. "I think you know what I want, Miss Lawson. You're digging into things you shouldn't be. Things that don't concern you." Monica's grip tightened on the phone. They concern me when they involve my brother. Eleanor's laugh was soft, almost condescending. Your brother is just a pawn, Miss Lawson. This is bigger than him, bigger than you. If you know what's good for you, you'll back off. Monica's heart pounded in her chest, but her voice remained steady. I'm not backing off. I'm going to expose you and everyone involved in this conspiracy. There was another pause, longer this time. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice was colder, more dangerous. You're making a mistake, Miss Lawson. Walk away while you still can. Monica's hands shook, but she didn't flinch. I'm not afraid of you, Eleanor, and I'm not walking away. With that, she hung up the phone, her heart racing. Ace looked at her, his expression grim. That was Harrington, wasn't it? Monica nodded, her mind spinning. She knows we're getting close, and she's trying to scare me off. Ace leaned forward, his eyes hard. But we can't let her intimidate us. We're too close to bringing this whole thing down. Monica took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew Ace was right. They were on the verge of exposing the truth, of bringing the corrupt officers and their powerful allies to justice. But the danger was real, and it was closing in on them. The following day, they arrived at the courthouse, ready to present their findings to the judge. The courtroom buzzed with tension as reporters lined the halls, eager for any scrap of information about the case. Daniel's arrest had drawn national attention, and now, with the trial about to begin, the entire city was watching. Monica stood at the front of the courtroom, her heart pounding as she prepared to address the judge. She knew that the battle ahead would be long and grueling. The people they were up against had power, influence, and resources that far exceeded her own. But she wasn't fighting alone. As the judge entered the room, the buzz of voices fell silent. Monica glanced at Ace, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. They were ready. The judge took his seat, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Monica. Miss Lawson, he said, his voice stern but fair. You may proceed. Monica stepped forward, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of everything they had uncovered. Your Honor, she began, the evidence we have gathered will not only exonerate my brother, Daniel Harris, but will expose a network of corruption that reaches the highest levels of our city's government and law enforcement. The room was silent as Monica laid out the details of the conspiracy, presenting documents, witness testimonies, and connections between the corrupt officers and their powerful backers. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of a system that had been allowed to fester in darkness for far too long. As Monica spoke, she could feel the tension in the room mounting. The judge's expression remained neutral, but she could see the flicker of interest in his eyes. He was listening. He was paying attention. When she finished, the courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The judge leaned forward, his gaze steady. Miss Lawson, the court will take your evidence under serious consideration. We will reconvene tomorrow to hear the testimonies of your witnesses. Monica nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They had made it this far, but the fight was far from over. As she and Ace left the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle had just begun. The people they were up against wouldn't go down without a fight, but she was ready. She had to be. For Daniel, for justice, for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. The courtroom was filled to capacity the next morning. The tension in the air was palpable, an almost suffocating pressure hanging over everyone inside. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras ready to capture every moment, while the city's residents and activists packed the benches, eager to witness the climax of a case that had sparked outrage across the nation. Monica sat at the front of the courtroom, her heart racing but her face calm and composed. She had been through countless trials before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about clearing her brother's name anymore. It was about exposing a system that had been rotting from the inside for years. The eyes of the city, and perhaps the country, were on them now. Every word, every piece of evidence presented today could either bring justice or let corruption continue to flourish unchecked. Her brother Daniel sat beside her, a mixture of anxiety and determination etched on his face. Though he had been freed on bail the previous night, his spirit was far from unburdened. The wounds from his wrongful arrest, both physical and emotional, still weighed heavily on him. His wrists bore the faint marks from the handcuffs, but the real scars, the ones of humiliation, betrayal, and systemic racism, ran deeper. Monica glanced at him, offering a reassuring nod. She had promised him that they would fight this together, and she was ready to deliver on that promise. Today, they would face the system head-on. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and a hush fell over the room as Judge Marston entered. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a reputation for fairness and integrity, took her seat behind the bench. Her eyes, sharp and attentive, swept across the room before settling on Monica and her team. "Miss Lawson," Judge Marston began, her voice calm but commanding, "you may proceed with your opening arguments." Monica stood, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice steady as she spoke. "Your Honor, the case before us today goes far beyond the wrongful arrest of my brother, Daniel Harris. What we are dealing with is a deeply ingrained system of corruption that has festered within our city's police department and political infrastructure for years. This is not just about one bad arrest. It is about the countless lives that have been ruined, the families torn apart, and the trust that has been shattered by a system designed to protect." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Today we will present evidence that links high-ranking officers in the police force to organized criminal activities, including robbery, drug trafficking, and money laundering. These officers have used their positions of power to manipulate the system, to silence those who dare to stand against them, and to frame innocent people, like my brother, for crimes they did not commit." The weight of her words hung in the air, and the room was deathly silent. All eyes were on her as she turned to present the evidence that had taken weeks to compile. Monica walked to the center of the courtroom, holding up a series of documents and digital records that Ace had painstakingly uncovered. "These are financial records," she said, projecting them onto the screen behind her. "They show the flow of illicit funds through shell companies controlled by high-ranking officers in the police department. These funds were used to pay off judges, city officials, and other officers who participated in the cover-up of their crimes." She continued, laying out the intricate web of connections between the corrupt officers, the local government, and the criminal organizations they had been protecting. The evidence was overwhelming, and as Monica spoke, she could see the faces in the courtroom change, from skepticism to shock, and then to anger. The prosecutor, a man with a tight expression and a rigid posture, tried to object. But Monica had anticipated his every move. Every piece of evidence she presented was airtight, carefully crafted to withstand scrutiny. When she had finished laying out her case, Monica turned to the jury, her voice softer but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about my brother. This is about every person who has been wronged by a system that sees them as expendable. Every person who has been targeted because of the color of their skin, or because they stood in the way of those in power. We have a chance today to begin to repair that system, to hold those responsible accountable, to show that no one is above the law." She stepped back, allowing her words to settle into the hearts and minds of those present. The prosecutor, visibly rattled, stood to deliver his own arguments. He attempted to downplay the scope of the corruption, focusing instead on Daniel's arrest and trying to justify the actions of the officers who had detained him. But the more he spoke, the more transparent his defense became. The evidence was too strong, the connections too clear. After the opening arguments, the testimonies began. Monica called witness after witness to the stand. Former officers who had left the force out of fear for their lives, community members who had been silenced by threats, and finally, a key witness, Officer Jackson, one of Daniel's former colleagues. Jackson had been hesitant to testify, knowing the risks involved, but Monica had convinced him that this was their last chance to expose the truth. His testimony was damning. He spoke of secret meetings, of officers being paid off to turn a blind eye to criminal activity, and of Daniel's growing concern as he had uncovered pieces of the puzzle. They knew Daniel was getting too close, Jackson said, his voice trembling slightly. He was asking too many questions, and they couldn't afford for him to find out what was really going on. That's why they set him up. They knew he wouldn't stop until he exposed them. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Jackson's words heavy in the air. The truth was out now. There was no turning back. Monica felt a surge of hope as Jackson stepped down from the stand. They were so close. All they needed now was to survive the cross-examination and present the final pieces of evidence that would seal the case. But just as the trial seemed to be reaching its turning point, an unexpected development shook the room. The doors to the courtroom opened once again, and in walked Eleanor Harrington, her presence commanding attention. She was impeccably dressed, her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun, and her expression cold and calculating. She took her seat at the defense table, her sharp blue eyes locking onto Monica. Monica's stomach turned. Eleanor had made her move. The judge looked down at the papers in front of her, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Miss Harrington, to what do we owe this sudden appearance?" Eleanor's lawyer stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, my client has new evidence that she believes will exonerate the officers in question and discredit the accusations being made by Miss Lawson." Monica felt a chill run down her spine. She had known Eleanor would try to stop them, but she hadn't expected her to show up in court so brazenly. The judge, clearly suspicious of the timing, nodded warily. "Proceed." Eleanor's lawyer began to present what they claimed was evidence that Daniel had been involved in illegal activities, that his investigation into the corrupt officers had been nothing more than a cover for his own misconduct. It was a desperate move, and Monica could see through it immediately. The so-called evidence was fabricated, clearly an attempt to muddy the waters and discredit Daniel. But Monica wasn't about to let them get away with it. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she stood tall, her voice steady but filled with fire. "Miss Harrington," she began, her gaze locking onto the older woman. "You've been involved in several questionable real estate deals over the years, haven't you? Deals that coincided with criminal activity in the neighborhoods you were vitalizing." Eleanor's smile faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Monica leaned forward, her voice sharp. "You've been laundering money through those real estate deals for years, using the police to protect your interests, and framing innocent people to keep the heat off yourself." The courtroom gasped, and Eleanor's face hardened. "Your Honor," Monica continued, "we have documented evidence that links Miss Harrington's real estate empire to the same criminal network that framed my brother. This is about more than just a few corrupt officers. This is about a conspiracy that goes all the way to the top." Monica laid the evidence before the court, connecting the final dots between Eleanor, the corrupt officers, and the criminal organizations that had been operating under the city's nose for years. The judge's expression grew more serious as she reviewed the documents. "Miss Harrington, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Eleanor's face remained impassive, but her silence spoke volumes. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the judge turned to Monica. "Miss Lawson, I find your evidence compelling, and I believe we have seen enough to proceed to trial. The charges against your brother will be dropped, and we will begin a full investigation into the corrupt officers and Miss Harrington's involvement." A wave of relief washed over Monica as the judge's words sank in. They had done it. Daniel was free, and the system that had tried to destroy him was finally being held accountable. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Monica turned to Daniel, who had tears in his eyes. He pulled her into a tight hug, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Monica. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Monica smiled, blinking back her own tears. "We did this together, Daniel, and it's not over yet." As they left the courthouse, hand in hand, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Signs demanding justice were held high, and chants of support echoed through the air. For the first time in weeks, Monica allowed herself to feel a sense of victory. But she knew this was only the beginning. The battle for true justice was far from over. They had exposed a dark corner of the system, but there were still countless others who needed their voices heard, who needed someone to fight for them. As she and Daniel stood on the courthouse steps, bathed in the light of the setting sun, Monica felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they would continue to tear down the walls of injustice and build a future where no one was silenced by the system. And this victory, this hard-fought, bittersweet victory, was just the first step in that journey. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. Click the bell to be the first to know about the next story. Leave a comment and share your opinion. In the meantime, pick one of our other videos. I'm sure you'll love it.